Hello? Anybody home?
Hey Mitch, love your site and blog. We just got 2 Canon C300s and have learned so much from you and your guests.
Hi, Daily Visitor here. Just wanted to thank you for all your time and effort put into the site. Planet 5D has become a vast resource for me.
Hi, everybody. This is Tony Toscano, and Planet 5D is my favorite podcast. It gets an A.
Hi, you've reached the Planet 5D blog. It's brilliant. Everything you want to know about photography and video is here. It was here yesterday, it's here today, and it'll be here tomorrow. Come back soon.
Planet 5D. Welcome to anything and everything DSLR and beyond. 5D. This is the official Planet 5D podcast.
Welcome, Earthlings. My name is Planet Mitch, and this is episode number 23 of the Planet 5D podcast. And we have a wonderful guest with us today by the name of Zack Arnold. But first, before we get to Zack, I would like to introduce you to our podcasting team, which of course consists of Barry Anderson from barryanderson.com, who is the co-author of the best-selling HDSLR book on the planet called the DSLR Filmmaker's Handbook. Hey, Barry.
How are you doing today, Mitch?
Well, so far no kidney stones, but not spend the whole podcast talking about that this week. Our guest today, as I said, oh, by the way, Pamela Barry is not here. She's on the way somewhere, driving in her car, going absolutely crazy, I'm sure, sitting in a car for the next 10 hours. But today's guest is a young man by the name of Zack Arnold, whom I've never met face-to-face, but I've actually heard him on several podcasts. Zack is a professional editor, and he's very famous for a TV show that runs on the USA Network. Actually, it doesn't run anymore, called Burn Notice. And we're going to talk today about all sorts of things, including fitness and health, as well as editing. So, after all that ado, welcome, Zack.
All right, welcome. I'm very, very happy to be here, so thanks for having me.
We're thrilled to have you because, I mean, even though this is the first time you and I have ever met, quote-unquote, face-to-face, you and I have become very familiar in the last couple of weeks because, and let's just jump right into the fun stuff, you've gotten involved very heavily in fitness, which I know has nothing to do with filmmaking and stuff, but sort of does. Because you've started a website called fitnessinpost.com, and you're trying to get a lot of us, including me, to get up and get active. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the idea is that I think it's funny that you had said to me, well, fitness has nothing to do with filmmaking, because I've actually disagreed with that for about a decade now. My two passions in life have been filmmaking and trying to find a way to survive filmmaking. Because being a film editor, the environment is not the best environment for maintaining optimal health, and I've been trying to use just all the techniques that I learned from when I was younger, because I was in martial arts for years. I played football, I played baseball, I did yoga, and I try to find ways to stay healthy despite the fact that I'm working in a dark room for like 14 hours a day. So what I decided about a year ago was, what if I take this passion and that passion and I bring them together? And I decided that it's working for me. It took me about 10 years of experimenting to crack my own personal code and figure out how do I stay healthy. And once I figured that out, I started having a lot of my colleagues and friends coming up to me, and they were saying, well, wait a second, you're working on network TV shows and you're working 14 hours a day and you have 2 young kids. How is it even possible that you have this much energy and you feel good? I'm like, well, here's how I do it. And I thought to myself, well, instead of just always answering people in person, what if I put up just like a little blog or a website with some links that would be helpful to them? And then I started doing that and people responded. And then I said, well, what if I got exercise groups together with my friends and we went hiking, or we all worked out and, you know, did a Beachbody program together? And I started getting great responses to that. And I said, what if I did this for real? What if instead of just doing it for my friends or for people that approach me at, you know, like user group meetings, what if I just went after the whole industry and tried to get everybody in the industry to just come around to the idea that one of the best tools, or the best tool that we have as an editor, is right here. It's our brains and it's our bodies. It's not any kind of plug-in program. It's not your operating software. It's yourselves. That's the number one tool you have as an editor. And I thought, what if I try to impart that idea to the people in our industry and get them to start investing in not only the technology and the software, but get them to invest in themselves. So that's kind of the idea behind Fitness in Post, and it's still very early, very much in a beta stage. I'm learning a lot about how to build websites and how to get the information out there and how to build these different challenge groups, but the response so far has been nothing short of overwhelming, and I'm just trying to find a way to really make it work for as many people as possible and just start this revolution of people no longer thinking that filmmaking and fitness are separate things and they can actually work together.
Well, as I can attest, you've got me involved in this whole process, and I'm thrilled to be doing it. And for those people who don't know, I sit on an exercise ball, which is why you see me bouncing if you're watching the YouTube video or the live show. Zack happens to be working on a treadmill, and he's not currently treadmilling, but I can tell you're standing there, aren't you?
Yes, I'm standing on my treadmill, but it's not running because I don't want to make people dizzy.
Well, we can actually see you in the mirror behind you, so...
Oh, yeah.
We've got an entire... It's kind of strange because we can see your desktop and...
Exactly, yeah. Well, the way that my room is set up, I actually have the monitor in front of me, so rather than me being against a wall like most editors are with somebody behind them, because I stand and I'm on a treadmill, the last thing a client wants to do is watch my butt all day running on a treadmill. So I actually have the couch in front of me and the TV in front of me, and behind me, I'm working out of my house. I just happen to have a mirrored wall, so it's just by circumstance that happens to be set up that way.
So do you find that's any kind of a distraction at all to be working, A, standing up, and B, moving while you're doing it?
No, actually, I find it completely the opposite. I sat for years and I lived in an Aeron chair like most people do, and I'm thoroughly convinced that Satan designed the Aeron chair because it is absolutely the worst possible thing ergonomically for your body. And I had horrible lower back problems, and I was stiff all day, and I had poor circulation in my legs, and I was in my mid-20s, and I felt like I was 70. And I said, there's got to be a better way. So I ditched the Aeron chair, and the first thing that I did was I got one of the exercise ball chairs like you're bouncing on right now, and that fixed most of my lower back problems, but I was still sedentary, and I still didn't feel very interactive with my material. So I said, all right, I'm just going to make the jump, and I'm going to try a standing workstation. And within, it wasn't even a day, it was maybe half a day, I said, this is the way that I want to work, and I'm never going back. And the analogy that I give people is the idea of a conductor in an orchestra, right? As editors, we don't want to sit and be sedentary, just kind of passive in front of our material. We want to be like a conductor in an orchestra. How many conductors have you seen that are sitting in a chair in front of the orchestra? None of them, because they want to be interactive, and they want to move, and they want to have their energy lead the orchestra and lead all the individual players, and I see my job as an editor the same way. So I stand, and I introduced a treadmill about a year and a half ago, and now I know it sounds funny, but it's almost like the more engaged I want to be with the material, the faster I go. It's kind of like I'm running the hamster wheel. And I keep thinking to myself, well, if I run fast enough, maybe it'll render faster. I'm really hoping somebody develops that technology, because you want to talk about getting people in shape. You get the render bar to start moving. The faster that you move, trust me, people are going to get in shape real fast. So I'm going to start developing a pilot program for that. But that's the idea, is that I just really like being interactive. I like being alive, having energy, and not being so passive. But the one thing that I do sitting is watching dailies, because I want to be in the position of my audience members. So when I watch dailies, I'm the first person on the planet that gets to see this material other than whoever was on set. So I need to experience it like my audience, so I sit down on a couch in front of a TV and I watch all my dailies for a scene. But as soon as I'm in the editor mindset, then I'm up and I'm in front of my computer standing, and usually with the treadmill going.
Awesome. Let's talk a little bit about editing, just because I don't want to completely dominate the whole conversation about fitness, because that's just where I happen to be right now, especially with the whole kidney stone issue, and there's the second time I mentioned it. But one of the questions that I've always wanted to know, and since you're here, I as an editor, kind of maybe it's not even really an editor question, but how much of TV shows that we watch today, like Burn Notice, which, by the way, I apologize because I've never actually watched it. I've seen the commercial.
What, Mitch? That's
Where's the disconnect button?
yeah, no doubt.
I know. I watched several USA.
You would love the show, Mitch. I don't know what's wrong with you. No, that was one of the best shows on TV over the last whatever 7+ years.
Yeah, 7 years. Well, thank you.
You see,
I'm a fanboy of the show, and I didn't know that you were editing it, so I'll give you props because you kept me entertained.
Zach did starting season 4. I was listening to your podcast the other day about how you edited and where you came in the process, and the fact that when you started in season 4, you actually went back and like memorized every episode from seasons 1 through 3.
Yes, I did indeed.
Fascinating. But getting back to my question, and again, I'm so sorry. I will go back and start watching, because, see, I found out about Burn Notice in the middle of the process, and so I kind of, it's one of those things where, and I never went back and started at episode 1, season 1, so I'll get there,
sure.
Okay? But one of the questions I have is, how much of the sound that we listen to is done through ADR or re-recorded, and how much is actually done live on set?
That's a really good question that is obviously going to vary from TV show to TV show. On Burn Notice, we're talking specifically about Burn Notice, we had the best on-set sound mixer that I've ever had on any project in the history of my career. And there was probably, of every single line of dialogue that was recorded, there were maybe 5 lines total per show that would have to be recorded for technical reasons. Wow. So we had location shooting all over the show. This wasn't like sitting on a nice, quiet set. Like, we were on bridges over water, we were on freeways. So that the sound itself should not have been as good as it was, but we had an amazing, amazing sound mixer. So from the technical perspective, almost all of it is live recordings from set. When you're talking about ADR in general, our show was laden with creative ADR because it was such a complex show as far as the plot twists and all the information that the audience needed to know. And the turnaround was so fast that they would write a script, get it out, shoot it, and then all of a sudden we'd be watching and they're like, well, wait a second, why does he need the key card to get into that door? Okay, well, we're going to need to add a line of ADR, so we're going to have to put it off camera where they're saying, you need to get the key card for this reason, right?
Right.
So there was a ton of creative ADR just to clarify the story, especially since we were on basic cable. Basic cable is not like HBO where they really want to stretch the audience's imagination. They want to make it pretty clear and kind of on the nose, making sure that the audience gets everything. So if there's any story point that did make sense, there's a lot of creative ADR additions, but technically there was almost none.
Cool. That's
awesome.
Something that's always I've always been really curious about that side of it, because when ADR is done wrong or when the sound is done wrong, it's so obvious.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like, for example, when I was on Glee, I worked on that show. There was a rule. They just said no ADR ever, unless there was like there was something wrong with the mic or there was a dropout. Like, if there's a horrible technical reason, they would record it. But otherwise, just no ADR. I was told that as soon as I walked in. I'm like, well, do I need to add a line here? They're like, nope. Ryan Murphy's rule is no ADR, period, because he doesn't want anything distracting. So whatever they record is what you use. And I actually really, really enjoyed that rule as an editor, because it meant I didn't have to worry about how to cut around added ADR lines.
That's so cool. Speaking of shows, my daughter loves Glee. So how many episodes of Glee did you do?
Just one. I was just helping out a friend of mine who he was actually going out for his wedding for a month, and they called me up and they're like, hey, can you cover for one episode? So I was only there for like 5 or 6 weeks, but I got to do a whole episode of Glee, which is basically covers the gamut of everything that they do, because I ended up doing several musical numbers and all kinds of craziness. And I went from, I think it was a Wednesday on Burn Notice, and Thursday went over to Glee. So in the span of 1 week, I was going from just one show to the polar opposite other show. So it was a really interesting experience as an editor.
Well, how long does it actually take to cut, say, a single episode? You said 5 weeks on Glee. Is that typical?
Yeah, that's about right for a single episode of TV. To get the first cut done, which basically minus visual effects and any type of finished audio needs to be broadcast ready, and you have 2 days after they're done shooting. So Burn Notice was a 7-day shoot schedule, so I would have 9 days from the day that I got my first footage until handing in a first cut. That was the whole episode with everything in it, nothing cut out yet. Music, sound effects, temp visual effects. We've got 9 days to do the first episode, and then after we hand in the editor's cut, then it's about 2.5 to 3 weeks of director's notes, producer's notes, showrunner notes, network notes, studio notes, just lots and lots of notes.
Wow.
Yeah, but the first turnaround is crazy. The editor's cut was by far the toughest part on Burn Notice because there was a lot of work to do in that period of time.
So it does sound like you would spend almost 24 hours working on each day.
Oh, yeah. On average, during first cut, it was 14, 16-hour days for 9 days straight.
How many? Go ahead.
I was going to say, and then after that, for director's cut, producer's cut, which is, if I'd left before 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night, it felt like a half day. I felt guilty. I was like, wow, I'm leaving at 8:30 tonight? The sun is almost going down? This is just wrong. They're going to fire me because I've only been here for 10, 11 hours.
What do you have a staff of assistant editors, or is it literally a one-man band?
No, there's a group of assistants. On our show, we had 3 editors and we had 2 assistants. So our assistants would rotate between 2 shows and be responsible for 2 at once. So basically on a first cut, I would do all of the dialogue editing. I would, because I personally like cutting music, I'm really protective of my music choices and my music edit, so I'll cut in all the music. But my assistants are really, really active and engaged in doing all the sound design work because there's only so much time in the day to get all this stuff done. So usually I'll pass off all the backgrounds, all the sound effects, all the hard sounds, all the just ambience, everything goes to the assistant editors, and they build out all of my sounds, which I really, really appreciate, and they do an amazing job with.
Were you guys editing on Media Composer?
Yes, we were on Avid everywhere from version 2.8 all the way up to version 7 by our last season.
We do actually have somebody in the chat room, by the way. Yay!
Hey! Hi!
Alex is from London, and Alex wants to know, did the workflow change as seasons moved on? And if so, what prompted those changes?
Yes, so I can say that the workflow changed in the sense that they started shooting with different cameras. The first 3 seasons were shot with Super 16. Season 4 was shot with an XD cam, a Sony XD cam. Season 5 was the Red, and then season 6 and 7 were the Arri Alexa. So from the production standpoint, the workflow changed a lot. From the post standpoint, we had the exact same workflow season 1 that we did season 7, which meant that 7 years later it was getting pretty painful because we were doing things the same way as season 1. And by the time we were done with season 7, we were told we were the only scripted narrative show on cable that was still cutting in standard def. So I never got to cut in high def, even like high def proxies. So we were working at 14:1 avid resolution, which is about as good as the quality of this YouTube video right now, literally. And it was all 4:3 letterbox, so it was a challenge.
Wow.
Yeah.
That just seems a little off, doesn't it?
Was it fun when you got to? Well, actually, you got 2 questions. One, was it fun when you got to see the final high-res version, and/or B, did you not want to look at it because you just spent 6 weeks of your life and you're like, I don't want to see this anymore?
I would say, first of all, yes, it was great to see the final version. What I didn't like was the fact that the first time I saw it was on USA Network when the show aired. I'm a big
Anything
fan
you don't like
actually,
is there.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm a big fan of, as an editor, I know this is really picky, but I kind of like to be able to see my character's eyes. And the resolution was so bad that there were some shots where I couldn't tell which way their eyes were looking. And that's kind of how you determine the way you edit a scene. So I'd watch it on TV, and I'm like, oh my God, they're not even looking at the person they're talking to right now. So in that sense, it was very frustrating, but it was great to finally see it color corrected in high def and looking great. But I obviously prefer to be cutting in high def from day one from dailies because then I have a much better sense of how the audience experiences it. And now that's the case. Like the show that I went on to on ABC last year was all high def, so I didn't have those problems. But there was a stark difference between what I was cutting and what I saw on TV.
So I have some, I guess, not hypothetical, kind of like an abstract questions for you. I can't remember the editor's name. I think she was the lead editor at MGM back in the day. And her rule for editing was when it needs to be edited, you cut. You know, continuity doesn't matter. Nothing matters. When it needs to be cut, it needs to be cut. Right. And I hear so many people today now so consumed with, you know, everything, whether it's sound, music, edit, performance, everything, that they're trying to get all of them to line up. And in the real world, even on the most quality productions, rarely does that happen. So do you have like your own cheat sheet for when can you kind of say, okay, I have to lose this battle and move on, or is it literally always a case-by-case basis? Did you kind of develop any workflows like that over the years?
Right. I mean, I've definitely taken a lot from a lot of the things that Walter Murch has written, because he has that list and that hierarchy of things that you should be looking at when you're making a cut, and that's actually something that I've taught to my students at USC. For me, there's really only two things that I care about that have to be right with every single cut and every single scene. The audience has to be feeling what I want them to be feeling, and I have to know where their eyes are at every single moment of the scene. If I can't do one of those two things, then I need to find a way to fix it, which means that if the audience is feeling the emotion that they need to, and I know they're looking where they need to be, if my continuity isn't working, I don't care because the audience isn't going to see it. If they're watching it 3 or 4 times later and they're not feeling the same things and they're not distracted because they know what they're watching already, they're probably going to notice continuity mistakes, which is why some of the best films or best TV shows you watch over and over and you're like, well, wait a second, well, that's a mistake and that's a mistake and that's a mistake. It's because you notice it because you're not really terribly interested in what's going on the 3rd or the 4th time, but I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the experience that somebody has the first time they watch it. So all of it is kind of superfluous. If they feel what they want and they're looking where I want them to look, then everything else falls into place. And of course, I'm using music and I'm using sound and I'm using good performance and I'm using camera techniques. All of those things factor into it. But the hierarchy is feel what you're supposed to be feeling, look where you're supposed to be looking, and the rest of it will take care of itself.
That's awesome. Let me furtherly ask a question. I know on episodic television, especially in dramas, you have directors that are rotating in. You know, it's not one person that heads up all of them. So you have different creatives that all go to a similar Bible. They have a similar, you know, there's a certain style that everyone tries to fit within, but then everyone tries to infuse their own, you know, their own magic to the puzzle. Sure. As an editor, when you're saying that, like, you want to know where the audience is looking, how much do you get to do in the edit with the clips that you're given? You know, if some director decides to shoot it this way, and you're like, oh man, it would have been nice to have that framed up on the left so that they'd be looking over there, but you framed them in the center. Like, how much of that are you finding that you're like, you know, they've done it wrong, or you wish they would have done it a different way, versus, you know, you're the genie in the box and you can recut it however you want to make it work? Right. You know, where does that battle lie for you?
For the most part, that isn't a battle that I've had too much, just because you always have the same DP on a show, or most of the time. We went through 3 or 4 DPs on Burn Notice over the years, but for the most part, the DP is always behind the camera, pointing at where it needs to point. So the director, yes, will be infusing their own ideas and their own thoughts about, oh, we should cover it this way or do this kind of camera move, but for the most part, you're getting the material in somewhat of a consistent sense because you have the same DP. But yes, there are places where a director may say, well, you know what, I know you usually do it this way, but I'm going to try and do the whole scene in a oneer because I want to be awesome. And then you do what you can do. You know, whatever the material is, you work with it. So my job as a TV editor, as opposed to as a feature film editor, is I'm trying to make the same show every single week. So I'm taking what the director interprets as their version of the show, and I'm doing my best to improve it, or if they nail it, just taking their vision. But at the end of the day, in TV, the director's not the last word. The showrunner and the studio and the network are the last word. So the director is just part of the process. So yes, sometimes you'll go through, you'll do the director's cut exactly as they ask, and then the showrunner will look at it and say, well, we don't do that on this show, so let's just not do that, and let's undo it. And then you do. So there's sometimes a period of trial and error where the director really wants to get their vision out and their vision doesn't work, and then we just undo it. So it's not like the director has final cut the way that they would in their own feature.
So then let me ask this one question, Mitch. Is there, you may not be willing to admit because it may be politically unwise for your career, but was there one thing that you got that you're the most proud of, that you feel like you fixed in the edit, that you're like, man, it came like this, and I did this to make it awesome.
Right.
Do you have a moment like that you're just proud? You're like,
not only that, but I can give you the episode number and I can tell you exactly where to go. Yes, this is probably not only for Bird Notice, but for my entire career. This is the piece that I'm most proud of. It's also available on my personal website as well. But the beginning of episode 501, which is the season 5 premiere, there's this montage that's about 90 to 100 seconds, and it's basically a retelling of the last 6 months of Michael's life. At the end of season 4, there's a huge turning point in the show. In the beginning of season 5 is, all right, what's next? Now what is the show going to do? It's kind of like a rebranding in a way.
Correct.
And there's this montage that explains everything that's happened to Michael over the last 6 months. And it looks like from your nodding that you've seen it.
Yes, I have.
So knowing that you've seen it, what if I told you that was not scripted and it didn't exist until post?
Wow.
That was
you just so they creatively wrote that bit, and then you went through and found all the footage to tell the story?
No. It literally didn't exist. The show on paper started with Michael walking down the hallway and swiping the key card. That was the beginning of the episode. And it went all the way to producer's cut, and the producers are like, well, this is a really small way to start a rebranding and a reboot of the show. We need something to get people excited, even if they're new viewers. We want them to see that we're bigger, we're better. Like, what can we do? Like, I know, why don't we create, this cool montage where we show everything that happened, because we had a card that faded up and said 6 months later. It's like, what if we knew what happened during those 6 months? They're like, that's a great idea. So basically, Matt Nix, the show creator, sent me a paragraph of voiceover, and he said, here, make something with this. I'm like, okay, so are you guys going to shoot all this material? Well, no, we can't afford to shoot anything. I'm like, okay, so what are we going to make it with? Well, we're just going to have to use some of our old material. So basically, I spent the next week and a half going through all of the old shows, which is the first 4 seasons, which if I do the math right is 60-some episodes. And I was going through old shows and not going through the final master. I was going through dailies, finding pieces that were not in the old episodes, material that was not used, and repurposing that to create a montage that looked like was shot for the beginning of this season. So when you watch it, you think, oh, well, this is cool, this is a great idea. Now watch it again and think to yourself, none of this was shot for the montage, and I had to cheat all of it from old episodes. So that was like 3 weeks of my life. And when I show it to people, they're like, oh, that's really cool. And then I explain to them the story. They're like, oh, my God, I would kill myself. So, yes, episode 501, go on Netflix, watch the first 100 seconds. That is the proudest moment of my career and also the most exhausting 3 weeks of my career.
So is there, just in a logistics standpoint, going back through all the dailies, was there just a drive? Were you having to load stuff back on? What was the workflow? How did you get access to 60 episodes worth of raw dailies?
Yeah, so basically what we did, every episode has a box, literally. I'm not talking in a virtual world. In the real world, there's a cardboard box that has a bunch of DV cam tapes, it has binders, it has all the DVDs, like they archive them at the end of the season. So we brought in 60 boxes into our post space. And I would just say to the assistants, I was going through and scanning all the old episodes, and luckily, like Mitch had said, the first 3 seasons I basically memorized just to get the job. Going into the interview, I walked in and knew the first 3 seasons, and that's what got me the job. So I would say, hey, I want you to go to this action scene in this episode, and I want you to pull all the dailies, because we have all the old bins. We archive all the Avid projects. So I would say, scene 27 in episode 304, just pull in all the dailies for this scene, and then I would go through and scan the footage and say, well, here's a car exploding. This is the angle they used in the Airmaster. Now I need to use the angles that aren't used, and I need to trick it in such a way, whether it's making it black and white or flopping it or whatever it is, so a general audience member isn't going to recognize the material. And what I was also doing kind of covertly is I was using Twitter, because I have a lot of Twitter fans and people that are like huge Burn Notice fans, and I would just say, hey, pop quiz, everybody. In what episode did Michael put a bomb under a car? Because I couldn't remember, like, there's this scene where he puts on a bomb, what episode is, and then these people come back in 2 minutes. Well, it's episode 107 in the middle of Act 3. I'm like, yes! So I would go through and I would say, go digitize this stuff, and then I would trick it, and basically these people that are the diest of the die-hard fans, maybe 2 of them watched this montage and was like, hey, that's from another episode. Everybody else, including the diehards, is like, man, that was an awesome montage. And I would say, all right, now let's do a pop quiz and tell me which episodes all that footage is from. And they're like, what do you mean? It's all from episode 501. I'm like, nope. That's all from old seasons. And they're like, oh, that's so cool. So they started this whole thread on the Facebook Burn Notice message site on USA Network that was just about let's figure out where all these shots came from. So that was a really fun like social media connection to the whole process.
That's awesome.
Is that the show that you worked on or project you worked on that you had the most interaction with the fan base or the most avid fans, or have you had others where you found equal or greater passion?
No, by far, Burn Notice was the most social media connected project that I've worked on, and that may change in the future, but the ABC show that I was on last year, there wasn't nearly as much interest, but it was also a first-year show, and they were building a fan base.
Yeah.
But with Burn Notice, since I came in Season 4, there was already a huge fan base, but social media was just starting to explode at that time.
Yep.
So I decided I'm going to get on Twitter and I'm going to start interacting with fans because there really wasn't anybody else on the show doing that. And they all just kind of latched on to me and they say, he's the Burn Notice editor. I'm like, no, there are 2 others. There's 3 of us, I swear. I just be doing all the work. But because I was the only one active in social media, I kind of got the identity as the Burn Notice editor. And I felt bad because there were 2 other guys that had been there longer than me. But that's just the way that it ended up working out. But I loved the social media interaction on that show.
Well, here's a business question for you. You obviously have enough success where you could get on a network show, and there's a certain level in the hierarchy of what you get to work on, and Burn Notice isn't at the bottom of the list. Now, having left the show's over. The social media aspect, does that help, hurt, or not really do either for your career?
So far, I wouldn't say that it's had a big impact on my career itself. Like, nobody's looking and saying, well, we want to hire this editor because people on social media know who he is. I haven't gotten that experience at all. But even on the show that I was doing last year for ABC, because the show's Twitter feed and the showrunners, they were all connecting to me, and I was interacting. So in that sense, I think it helped that I had that connection, but at the end of the day, they're not hiring me because I have Twitter followers. If that's kind of the way to distill that question.
Yeah, well, I think some people find some actors get hired because they have a bigger fan base than others. Some people land jobs because they're more visible because of social media. It's kind of a nebulous thing as to how it maybe impacts you.
Right.
But I just wasn't sure if you were like, actually, yeah. Funny thing is this show happened to follow me because he was a Burn Notice fan, and that's why I got hired.
Sure.
It's not like your social media interaction makes you a better editor.
Right.
Just does it somehow.
It's certainly given me
I think
more.
You answered that, but that was the reason I asked the question.
Well, it has given me more connections in the sense that there are other editors that I've met because of it, that are other high-profile editors, and because of that, we become friends. And I've maybe only met them in person twice, but we interact all the time. They're like, "Hey, there's this new pilot over at Fox, or this or that. Are you available?" Right? So because of social media, I'm getting more opportunities and meeting more people. So I think in this day and age, if you are sitting at your house unemployed and you're saying, why are people not hiring me? Ask yourself, are you on social media? And if you're not, there's your problem. Because people don't pass along resumes anymore. They just meet other people and they give referrals. And maybe that's the way that it's always worked, but it's gotten a heck of a lot easier with social media. So like I had a friend of mine that works on a big Fox show as well. And he's like, hey, are you friends with this editor? Because he's on this other show and I want to get on this other show. I met him through social media. So because of that, we're able to connect, and I maybe can get him an interview, maybe not. But it's all about these referrals. So whenever people come up to me and say, well, it's always about who you know, it's like, well, great, well, then get to know people. Like, I moved out to LA and I knew 0 people. I came out here, drove 2,500 miles across the country from the Midwest having 0 contacts. So I just decided I'm going to meet people and I'm going to get out there, and there's no reason that anybody can't do that now.
All right, now I got more questions for you because of that. Because there's Yep.
I'm sorry. I got to hold you up. Hold on to those questions. Those are great questions, I'm sure. Alex in the chat room, and I know this applies right here, especially, and it's a great question because he says, were there rules about dealing with social media on behalf of Burn Notice? And I know that's a great question because I know people like Rodney Charters got in big trouble for doing social media and saying things they weren't supposed to say. So did you have to watch what you were saying?
Well, for the first 3 years I was on the show, I don't think anybody even knew that we were on social media because it was still kind of becoming a mainstream thing. I remember during season 7, though, they finally figured it out and they sent out all these moratoriums saying no pictures from set and no talking about episodes. And it didn't really apply to me because I was in post. And just if you use common sense, you're really not going to get yourself in trouble. So I never talked about episodes. I never mentioned what characters were going to be on, what the plot lines were. I would just say, hey, working on an awesome episode. Can't wait for you guys to see it. Or, man, this is such a fun scene. I wish you guys could watch it right now. But I never gave specifics. But there were people on set that would take a picture of like a major plot point, and it was like, well, duh. Like, maybe you shouldn't do that. So they really cracked down season 7, but it really didn't change my style too much just because I was using common sense and didn't give anything away until the show aired. And I was so interactive with the fans. Like, I would do live tweets during episode airings, and USA would get on board and they would let people know I was live tweeting. So they were really excited about my involvement. But, during the production phase, the rule is just don't say it. Like, be really general, be vague, but don't answer questions and don't give any details.
Okay, go Barry.
So there's a lot of people that are listening. It's the whole idea of how do you find work? Where do you want to work? Do you want to work in corporate America? Do you want to work in Hollywood? Do you want to start your own thing and be a content creator? You went from, I think you said, the Midwest to LA, didn't know anyone. You've spent years honing your craft, and now you're at a point where you have some gravitas behind you. You still want more. Social media is great. I could connect with you in social media, we talk, but usually what I find when people start to recommend other people or kind of create those networks, it's because you have a respect for what they do. Like if I show up and said, you know what, I'd really like to be an editor, I've never edited before, probably that's not going to go. So what were some of the things that you did when you first, either prior to going out west or for the first couple of years, that got you in a position where if you did meet someone, even if they hadn't seen your work, even if it's not high profile, someone's like, hey, this guy is awesome. We should do something with him.
Right. Well, the two things that I always tell people when they're either breaking in or they're trying to change careers, whatever it is, and they say, well, I want to do what you do someday, I say there are two key components. There's a whole bunch of details, all kinds of stuff to learn, but you can distill it down to two core factors. One is your work has to be awesome, and two, people need to know that you exist. If you have one or the other, you're not going to be successful. If you have amazing work and you live in a hole and nobody knows who you are and you have no connections, that work is going to go nowhere. Or if you're a social media butterfly, everybody knows you, you go to all the networking parties, and your work sucks, you're not going anywhere either. So you have to have great work, and people have to know who you are. So I didn't know those 2 points when I moved out here and I was a kid in college. It was kind of an unspoken thing that I was trying to figure out. So I was basically an autodidact and taught myself everything on my own. I went to film. I didn't go to film school. I was in a liberal arts film program that was more about the history and aesthetics, and I watched Potemkin 5 times and wrote about old films. I came out with 2 short films and about 25 papers. So my background was not in here's how to learn Final Cut, and here's how to learn Avid, and here's how to edit. There's nothing like that. Like where I teach at USC, you walk out knowing exactly every step of the process and spending an entire semester just learning Avid or just learning how the camera works. I didn't have that, so I spent my free time learning the technology because that's what I wanted to do. That was the part that interested me. So for example, in college, I spent an entire summer that I had off, didn't even need to get paid. I just took an unpaid internship and learned After Effects for an entire summer. And that was a tool that I used right after I got out here. And 15 years ago, people were saying, well, wait, you know After Effects and you can edit? Oh, man, we want you to work on this and that. And nowadays, it's no big deal. But 15 years ago, you didn't know both of them.
Well,
so
I would say that it is a big deal because I think now anybody who just edits that doesn't know After Effects, it's almost a non-starter for getting a job.
Agreed, and that's why I'm so glad that I started way back in the day, because now it's almost just assumed. If I'm cutting a scene, they're like, well, can you just composite that out? I'm like, I can, but you're not supposed to know that I can.
Yeah.
So it's kind of gotten to that point where the editors are expected to do so much more because the technology's made it that much easier, but 15 years ago it wasn't that way. So it made me much more marketable early on, and people hate me when I say this, but I've only been an assistant editor for 5 months. I came out because I knew Final Cut really well, I knew Avid really well, and I knew After Effects. Being an assistant editor at a trailer house, it was a small small place, there were like 2 or 3 editors, and they started to get really busy, so they just started handing me stuff because they knew that I could already cut and I had the experience, and within 5 months, I was promoted, and I've never been an assistant since. And that's because I had a lot of knowledge coming in. So what I tell people is that, number one, you have to hone your craft, and you have to learn everything you can on your own. Don't just say, well, there's no projects out there that are hiring me. The technology is there where anybody can do anything almost for free. You literally can do it for free if you have an iPhone. You can shoot your own footage. You can bring it into your system with iMovie, which is free. I don't recommend editing in iMovie, but you can for free. If you want to learn how to cut a scene, it costs $0 if you have an iPhone. So there's no longer any excuse to, well, the barrier is too high and I just can't learn. So you have to make your work awesome, and then you have to make sure that people know that the work exists and that you exist. So outside of those 2 things, the rest are just details.
Let me ask a clarification question.
Sure.
You said that you were only an assistant editor for 5 months. You came out there. Let me start with this. You said that when you went to college and your own personal, you were looking at the classics, Battleship Potemkin, and you were learning the technique of editing without the A, B, and C of the software.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is becoming more unique now, that most people learn editing and cutting, but they don't understand the theory. Do you think that gave you a leg up in learning that versus just learning the software?
There's no question that one of the biggest reasons that I became successful at the speed at which I did, if you look at the curve of me versus other people in the same position at my age, there's no question I moved up the ladder faster because of my theory background, and I will say without a shadow of a doubt, all I did was complain about it in college, and so did all of my classmates. We just want to make movies. We just want to learn Avid. We just want to learn Final Cut. Well, anybody can learn the software for free. You can go online. You can go on YouTube. You can get a $25 a month subscription to lynda.com. Anybody can learn that stuff. But what you need to know is why you are making the decisions that you're making, and the only way to do that is to understand how the good films and the good TV shows have done it in the past by studying them. So if you're, and I guarantee that a lot of the people that are watching this or listening to it, they're probably better than me using Avid or Adobe Premiere or Final Cut. I'm not an expert. I don't even love technology. Ask these guys. Just to get the Google Hangout thing figured out, it wasn't so good. But I know why I need to make the cuts that I need to make, and I have the instinctual ability to know what a good scene feels like and what it doesn't feel like, and the rest of it is just going on Google and figuring out why I can't do something. Well, I want to superimpose this shot over this one, so what button do I press? But if I know why I need to superimpose it for the emotional effect for my audience, that's what's important. So you can be the best in the world in the timeline and do all the cool stuff, but if I'm watching as an audience member and I don't know why you made those choices, then you're wasting your time.
Let me ask part 2 of that then. You came up in a position different than today. Same, I don't know how old you are, but probably somewhat similar to me. We didn't have iPhones. Things weren't cheap and readily free all the time. So that time where you moved out there, you were going to college learning stuff, to when you started booking work, how did you build your reel or the work so when people saw it they said, hey, this kid's got something, let's work with him?
Right, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and yes, the technological barrier was very, very different 15, 20 years ago when I was building a reel. But I literally started early in high school, and I would just do stuff for free. Like I had approached the football team because I played for the football team for a few years, and then I got injured, and I became the manager of the football team, like the equipment manager, because I wanted to be a part of it. I just physically couldn't do it because I had problems with my knee. And I said, hey, do you guys want a highlight reel? So yeah, they said sure. So they gave me all the VHS tapes, and yes, I said VHS tapes. They gave me all the VHS tapes of all the games, and I just sat down with 2 VCRs and a video toaster, and I cut a highlight reel. And added music and added these corny video toaster graphics and glow spinning transitions and all the stuff you see in these old videos. But that's how I learned editing. And the fact that I was learning on a VCR doesn't mean that I wasn't learning editing. And for example, I would go through and make highlight reels of funny lines from movies. So I would make these comedy montages. And then I got in college and I started offering to videotape and edit people's weddings. And like there was a big museum of art on the University of Ann Arbor campus, and through a connection, somebody said, hey, can you film my art exhibit? So I filmed their art exhibit and put music to it, and I just did everything I could to just build experience, build a resume, and then the big break that I got, I would barter editing a lot, and I was really into martial arts, and there was a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school, and the guy said, well, I'm trying to build my school. I want to do TV advertising and do training videos, and I'm like, hey, I'm broke. I have an idea. I'll do all your training videos and do your TV commercial, and then you can give me free lessons. So I basically talked myself in Jiu-Jitsu in exchange for doing like these 1-hour training videos, and that's where I use my After Effects skills. And as soon as I came out to LA, I put all that together on a VHS demo reel, and I started showing it to the editors that I was assisting for. And what people have to realize, they always feel like, well, I'm not working on these big, huge movies, so my reel stinks. You can't look at it that way. You have to look at it as, how good am I with the material that I'm given? And editors will recognize that. And somebody saw my reel and said, well, this is obviously all college work, but it's really, really well cut for college work. So, hey, guess what? I'm working on this show on the side for PBS. Do you want to help me out and maybe cut an episode? And I'm like, yeah. And that's where it started for me. I started helping, one of these freelancers and helping him, cover the work on this PBS show. And then they wanted to hire me, and that's when I became an editor. So it's not about, oh, well, I'm not working on the next Hunger Games movie. It's how good is the work given what you have. Because people understand that. If I see somebody that's doing really crappy work, but they're doing it on a high-profile film, that doesn't make their reel any better. It's about the quality work they're doing given the material.
I think your statement there of how good am I with the material I'm given is maybe the best piece of advice we've had on the podcast in its duration. So kudos for that. But let me ask one other question. That what you just said ties into another larger debate going on, and I don't know how familiar or how much you've run across this. But right now it seems like, when you're young and you're hungry, if you're in high school and you're in college and you're bird dogging things, working for free, kind of hustling, for work, that's acceptable. But once you get to a certain, age or a certain level, people are like, don't drive the market price down. Don't do things for free. Don't do things for cheap. And a lot of times, when I consult with people, I'm like, well, it can't be a hard and fast rule, because sometimes in order to move into a different area, you can't just sit there and say, well, someone's going to make it happen. You got to make it happen. But at the same right, having everyone out in the industry run and say, oh, for my shot, I'll do it for free, then you got scores of people basically undercutting the paid work that's out there. Do you have a particular stance, feeling, or thought on that?
I mean, do I have a canned response? No, but my feeling is that you have to do whatever it takes to make the path that you want to make. I'm not concerned about undercutting other people or making it harder for them, because all I'm focusing on is making the best version of myself and the best work that I can. And the strategy that I used for years, because I was a trailer editor for the first 3 or 4 years that I came out here, but I always knew that I wanted to do narrative. So I made a decision pretty early on in my career, when I was still single, didn't have kids, didn't have a mortgage, and I said, I don't want to do this in 10 years, but if I keep doing it, the transition in 10 years is going to be way more painful than now. So I'm going to drop my 6-figure-a-year job, and I'm going to work for nothing, because I want to cut narrative and I want to work on features. And I got an opportunity working on a really low-budget independent film that paid less than what I was making when I was an assistant editor. But I knew that it was something that was going to get me more in the direction that I wanted to go, and the movie ended up getting purchased by Fox Searchlight for $5 million. So that to me was kind of like that stepping stone of really, really living painfully and having no money for about a year, and then all of a sudden having a real movie on my resume where people would legitimately say, oh, well, he can work on a film. But then I was still broke, and I still had to find work, so I spent the next 4 or 5 years juggling really low-paid narrative work and doing really high-paid, high-level marketing work, working on trailers and marketing campaigns for huge movies like Oscar films and the big-budget summer films like, this is like 7, 8 years ago, so like Die Hard 4 and The Departed and Dreamgirls. Like, I would get paid really well working on that for 5, 6 months a year, and then the other 6 months I would get paid, $200 a week cutting a narrative feature just to build contacts, build connections, and build a resume. And that was really painful for years. But it got me to the point where I had enough of a resume that I could start being considered a long-form narrative editor and just getting work like that. And now I don't have to do that anymore. But I did whatever it took. I mean, I cut a feature film for 8 months for $0.
Wow.
Just because I wanted the connection. And the producer of that film ended up being the producer of 500 Days of Summer, and I almost got the job on 500 Days of Summer because I worked on this really, really low-budget film for $0 for 8 months. So that paid off. I didn't get the job, but it got me that close.
Well, and it's not like that contact went away. You know, that person is going to shoot else. You know, you've put yourself in that position.
Yes.
Here's another question that I found, you know, again, from back in the day. We're not that old, but the business has changed enough. You used to have a team. It was, you know, a group of people. You had your, you know, director, your cinematographer, you had your first, second AC, the film loader, you know, you had all this stuff. And nowadays it seems like everything's shrinking. Like you said, you used to just be an editor, you used to be a visual effects guy, you used to be whatever. Now you're all one. I'm finding that the positions of director of photography, your cinematographer, and the editor are quickly becoming maybe the two most powerful people in the business because they control almost everything. It seems like directors, you know, outside of the high-profile ones, are being marginalized in terms of their, you know, like the end say, you know, what it turns out like. Do you tend to think that's kind of the way things are going, or am I completely making that up?
Well, if you're saying that the editor is one of the most powerful people in the industry, then I would like to know what jobs you're working on. Because we're not getting paid that way.
No.
In TV, I would say that you're definitely on the right track. I think that directors and directors of photography, there's not that much difference anymore, where directors, if the director for hire, they show up for their 3 weeks, they do their job, they go home, and it's like, okay, great, thank you for doing your thing, right?
Yep.
When it comes to decisions being made in TV, I feel like outside of the showrunner, I have the most say of anybody on the show. When it comes to features, I think that it's still different. I haven't worked on any super, super high-budget feature films. I have friends that have, and they will say that increasingly the directors are becoming more marginalized. So you don't have a lot of up-and-coming Scorseses anymore. You have people that the studio knows will take the job because it's an opportunity, which means that at the end of the day the studio gets their own cut, and they get the final word, and the director's marginalized in that sense as well. There are definitely superstar DPs in films. There's no question about that. I think there are some in TV as well. So I would say that you're on the right track. I wish that they would figure out how to pay us accordingly.
Yeah, well, I never mean to insinuate that power equals money, because that's went out the window before as well.
Right.
But I think it's funny how, you know, so many people that I grew up with, they wanted to be the director because they had all the power, and people still come to me, I want to be the director, and I'm like, well, you know, if you're thinking about it from 20 years ago, it's different. You know, you can, like you said, you can blaze your own path and become the next, you know, name your Christopher Nolan or whatever. Those people still exist. But if you're talking about the law of averages, you know, if you're looking for that power and the most amount of say into the final project, I think the cinematographer and the edit/visual effects world, like you said, at the end of the day, does get a little bit more say than the director does in a lot of projects these days.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And if you really want to be a true auteur and you want to be a director that shapes something, go into documentary, because that's still where the director is king. Outside of that, I mean, if you want to be an auteur, the worst place you can go is TV, because directors, they're just, you know, crew members for hire. They just happen to be above the line. When the day comes that editors are considered above the line, then I'll say that we won. That's the one pet peeve that I still have, is that we have composers that are above the line and they absolutely deserve it, but why an editor is still considered below the line, that I don't quite understand. So that's something that I like the good fight for, and see that happen in my lifetime.
There are some great nuggets for our Planet 5D viewers coming through this show. I'm just sitting back listening to you guys and totally enjoying the whole thing. One thing I would like to sort of highlight is the term showrunner was new to me until about a year ago, and I know there are quite a few people that watch Planet 5D stuff that are kind of still newbies.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind explaining for our viewers what a showrunner does in case they don't know?
Yes. Well, the first thing that I'll tell people is the showrunner does not get people coffee, because that's what I thought at first. I'm like, oh yeah, the runner. He's the guy that gets us lunch. And you're like, no, the showrunner is the one that's in charge of everything. I'm like, the runner's in charge? What kind of operation is this, right? So most people think of a runner. That's the first job that you get either in college or out of college, and you are the gopher, the runner.
Right.
The term in television is the person that's in charge of the show. When you want to think about Christopher Nolan on a feature film, he would be called a feature runner if that term existed. All the decisions go through him. He's the final word. The buck stops at Christopher Nolan. When you're talking about TV, that's the showrunner. They're the one that runs about an editorial choice. It's going to go through all kinds of different departments, but the person that's going to put their finger down and say, nope, I want this or I want that is the showrunner. So they're the person that's in charge outside of the studio or the network. They have the final word.
Awesome. Until I knew all of that, it was really kind of a whole strange little mix. So I appreciate that. I know Barry's probably got a bazillion questions still in his mind, and we're almost at an hour. But there are a couple of questions I want to get to before we go. I actually heard you speaking on a podcast, and I apologize because I do not remember it. But in going through your bio and doing a little preparation, I found out that you were the guy that worked on a movie that was totally shot in, I think, Manchurian or Mongolian or some
Mandarin. It was in Mandarin.
And you edited the entire movie without understanding any of the language. How did that work for you?
Yeah, how did that work? That's a really interesting question. So the background is that, yes, the film was a Chinese film shot completely in Mandarin. It was an American director. She was brought on because China's trying to do the synergy with Hollywood where they want to become the next Hollywood. So they want to bring in American directors to infuse Hollywood filmmaking aesthetics with Chinese audiences, with Chinese actors that have Chinese cultural significance to the film, rather than just importing our films. And I was brought on to do a cleanup, which was basically a 2 or 3 week pass where I didn't have to understand the language. I just had to cut in the music and do cool transitions. And it was a show kind of like Burn Notice. And the director is one of our Burn Notice directors, which is how we got hooked up with it. And I was handed the first assembly, and we all watched it together, and our jaws just kind of dropped, and we said, this is completely unusable, and I don't even know where to start. And they started giving me notes, and I'm like, guys, these are not notes. Like, if you want this film to work, we need to start over. So it went from being a 3-week job to a 5-month job, and I essentially took the sequence of the film, and I hit delete, and I started over. So what I had to do was I had to edit the first cut phonetically because I had no subtitles. There's nothing on the screen. I had a transcript of the movie of the first cut, but it wasn't with time code. It was just like it was like reading a script basically. So I knew the general story and I knew the basic story beats in a scene, but I didn't know the dialogue. So I had to edit a scene phonetically, which would mean that I would have to go through and listen to the sound of the words and say, well, now they're ending on this line, so I want to cut to a close-up, so now I have to watch the footage in the close-up until I get to this sound and then cut to them. And the first week, I just about pulled all my hair out. But then kind of once I started to get the feel for it, I realized I was making all the same decisions that I would be if they were speaking English. I was looking at performance, I was looking at, rhythm, I was looking at inflection, I was looking at emotion. I just didn't happen to know what the heck they were talking about. So I cut the entire first thing. I couldn't cut any dialogue out because I didn't know what they were saying, so I just did a phonetic edit of the film and added music and added effects just like I would any other first cut. And then I delivered the first cut to Beijing because we were working remotely, and there was an assistant editorial crew in Beijing, and they went through and they put subtitles on, and I saw my first assembly, and I was like, oh, that's what they're talking about. So then I could start cutting it and say, all right, well, we don't need that line, and that's superfluous. And once I had subtitles, then I could be much more precise. Wow. But the first cut was just phonetic, but what I was also doing is I was learning the language. I was doing language lessons. So as I was watching it, I could at least pick out pronouns and understand basic dialect. So then I knew when a sentence break would happen, or I could understand the basics. And then when the film was over, a few months later, I actually traveled to China for 10 days and did a whirlwind publicity tour all over the entire continent, basically.
Wow.
So I had enough knowledge that I could speak basic Mandarin, most of which I've forgotten at this point. But all I did for 14 hours a day for 5 months was listen to people speaking Mandarin. So it was no different than being in the country, except they were saying the same things all day, every day.
That's a fascinating story. Just blows me away that you were able to do that. I'm very impressed.
Thank you.
One of the other things that I wanted to get to before we ever get out of here is your pet project.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't touched that yet. And I spent way too much time yesterday looking at your Kickstarter project, which is over and funded. But that's a movie called Go Far, the Christopher Rush story.
Mm-hmm.
How is that going at this point? I know you went through the funding of doing the final bit, and just tell everybody a little bit about that story, because it's absolutely fascinating. How long you've been working on it?
Sure. Yeah, so Go Far is a documentary film that I've actually been working on for about 7 years now. It's in the can, it's finished and complete, and I'm in the final stages of talking to several different online and video distributors and a theatrical distributor as well. So that's the point where we're at literally today, is conference calls with distributors. But for the last 7 years, I've been using Kickstarter and social media to raise the money one step at a time, literally making this movie $50 donations at a time. And it's the story of a former national poster child for the Muscular Dystrophy Association. So for those that are younger, they may not know who Jerry Lewis is anymore. But anybody my age or older, everybody knows the Labor Day Telethon. They know Jerry Lewis. He was one of Jerry's kids for 2 years. And he's actually somebody that I knew personally that I met in college. And I didn't know much about him, didn't know his past, but he and I were really good friends. And it wasn't until he passed away, so there's a spoiler alert for the movie, it wasn't until he passed away that I was at his funeral and I started hearing all the stories about what he had done when he was younger. And I learned that he was the first quadriplegic in the entire United States to become a licensed scuba diver. He graduated from college with honors. He graduated with a law degree. He did all kinds of just astounding things for regular people, but given that he was a quadriplegic and had no use of his arms or legs his whole life, it was astounding. Yeah, most of this I didn't even know, but then somebody stood up and started talking about this program called Go Far that he was developing for people that have obstacles, whether it's disabilities or poverty or whatever it is, developing this 5-step program. And it was like a lightning bolt came down from the sky, hit me in my brain, and said, bam, that's the title of a movie. And just from that day on, I said, I'm going to do whatever I can to get his story out and get it to other people, because that was his unfinished work. And I didn't know at the time whether or not I was going to be able to do it, but now 7 years later, I can say the first step of the process is done, which is I have a finished film that I can sell, and now I'm just trying to sell it. So that's where I am right now.
So you're expecting incredibly rich, right?
Oh yeah, documentaries, especially about disabled people, are just I'm going to be loaded. I will never have to edit again after I make my millions off of this movie, because I've been paying myself well so far the last 7 years.
Yeah, exactly. As I said, I've just become totally fascinated by the whole story and spent hours watching your stuff yesterday, and I cannot wait to see the entire movie. So I'm a fan. I'm really eager to see how that whole project turns out. When do you think there's a possibility of it being distributed?
If everything goes well the way that I think it's going to, I think within a month or two we'll start to see it popping up in theaters.
Really?
And then hopefully within, I don't know, maybe 3 to 6 months, and this is all fingers crossed because I haven't signed anything yet, so I hate jinxing myself. I'm very superstitious. But if it goes the way I want it to, 3 to 6 months you're going to be seeing it on digital platforms like iTunes or Hulu or Netflix or whatever 18 other things are invented between now and the end of the year. But the VOD world, the video on demand world, I'm hoping to get into that in the next 3 or 6 months. So that's the plan. So I'm hoping by the end of the year anybody can click a button and be able to watch it.
That's fantastic, and it's a great lesson. Of course, a lot of people, I don't feel like they understand how much work is needed to accomplish something like that. And to hear you talk about how you've spent 7 years working on this project and it's such a passion project is what I really want people out there that are watching and listening to grasp onto your passion for stuff like this, because that's what fuels the business. And And there are so many people that do the passion projects, and that's what I love to talk about.
Yeah, I mean the passion projects are what really fuel you.
Right.
Especially like what I did was I tried to combine the passion projects with the mainstream projects. I mean, half of the reason that my movie got funded was because of Burn Notice, because I just shamelessly went after all my Twitter followers and said, "Hey, I will live tweet this show, but go to gofarmovie.com and send me a $5 donation." And like I got Bruce Campbell on board, and he would sign scripts, and I would use those to raise money. And so the only reason I got where I did with my film is by shamelessly plugging my association with mainstream projects. So it was kind of a synergy of all those different things. So without one, I couldn't have had the other.
Are you able to tell us how much money you had to raise in order to finish the production?
I don't know exactly because I'm my own accountant and I'm a really, really bad accountant because I can't afford to pay anybody else to do it. But it wasn't much. It wasn't much more than $100,000. So the whole film, in its current form, which I've screened on a DCP theatrically and looks like a real movie, it cost me a little over $100,000.
Wow. Barry, we're at.
I have one statement and one question for him that will be a huge drop in quality after hearing about this project. It sounds amazing. I would like to commiserate you with something you said, the fact that people that are listening may not know who Jerry Lewis is. I'd just like to take a moment and realize how depressing that thought is.
Yes, isn't it?
Oh my God, that's heartbreaking to think about. Then the last question, going back to editing. A friend of mine and I have this, I guess, a mini clash because he has a hard set rule, and I just want to get your opinion on it. He always says when he's editing, one of the things he does to see if the edit really works is he turns off all the sound, any dialogue, music effects, and then he just watches it silently to see if it plays. And then I understand in theory why that's good, because sometimes you turn off like, yeah, this really doesn't work, and you're masking it with the other things. But I don't know if you really can look at an edit in abstract with none of the other elements and know if it works. What side of the aisle do you fall on?
I'm not going to give you a really easy definitive answer on either side because I definitely use that technique. I don't use it a lot, and I don't think it's an absolute must. Like, I don't tell my students at USC, you can't know for sure if the scene works until you watch it with no sound. There's no absolute rule because I do feel that the only person on the planet that's ever going to see it with no sound is you. As an editor, you're the only person that will ever see it that way.
Yep.
So if you're having trouble with a cut and you can't figure out why it's not working, it's a great strategy to use. Say, oh, well, maybe it's because there's a bump in the dialogue edit, or maybe the music's coming in at the wrong place and I'm feeling the wrong thing based on what I'm seeing. If you turn everything off and watch the cut or watch part of a scene, oh, okay, now I understand why it's not working. But if you're saying that the only way to judge a good edit is with the sound off, that I disagree with, because nobody's ever going to see it that way. And like I said earlier, I know it's a good edit if people are feeling what I want them to be feeling and they're looking where I want them to be looking. So whether or not I'm figuring that out with the sound on or off doesn't matter. But no, I don't think you can say an edit only works if the sound is off, because nobody's ever going to see it that way.
I like your philosophy. I'll go with that.
All right, Zach, I know this is a fascinating conversation, and I really don't want to close it out because I enjoy these kind of things. That's why Barry and I do them. But I also know our listeners and you and Barry and I all have lives that we need to get moving, and so we're going to wrap this show up.
Yes, we do need to get moving. There's no doubt about that. No, I feel about getting moving.
Wasn't that a good plug? Gosh.
Like that?
So that plug goes to your project called Fitness in Post. So people can go to fitnessinpost.com if they want to get up and get moving. And as I say, I'm greatly appreciative of what you're doing there, because you've gotten me moving, and I'm working on a new website, by the way, the little tidbit that hasn't been heard publicly, also having to do with some fitness, not specifically filmmaking fitness, but so I'm going to be launching a new website soon. But in order to do that, I wanted to get up and moving, and I found you working on the fitnessinpost.com site, and I'm very impressed with what you're doing there. So I really want all of our readers and listeners and watchers to go check that out and get involved, because it's a great thing to do. Get up off your butt and start moving. I also appreciate you for burn notice conversation, and if you want to plug anything else that you're working on right now, let's have it.
Well, I mean, outside of Fitness in Post, which consumes about 14 hours of my day, and then GoFar is about 6 hours of my day, then there's the other 4 where I sleep. Other than that, I can't publicly say what I'm going to next, but it's going to be, yeah. Well, once my ink is dried on the paper, then I can. I have a new gig. It's all tied up and ready to go. But until the paper's signed, I'm not allowed to say anything. But it'll be a pretty high-profile show that's going to be on Fox mid-season. And anybody that follows me on Twitter, I'm at many places on Twitter, but Burned Editor is my main profile, and then I have Fitness in Post as well. And I will be announcing what that show is as soon as I'm allowed and able to. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. That's Zack Arnold, in case I haven't said it enough, fitnessinpost.com. And thank you so much for being here. Barry, thank you for being along with us today.
Great to meet you, Zach.
Yeah, you too. Absolutely. Thanks for all the great questions. It's been a great conversation.
And thanks, too, to Alex and the other people who are in the chat room. For those of you who may not be tuning in live, if you want to tune in next time, go to planet5d.com/podcast, and you can get the URL to join us. We will send out emails to you to know when you can be with us on our next episode, which will not be next week, at least unless it's recorded, because next week I am going in to have a second procedure on my kidney stones. Yippee-ki-yay! And so,
I promise Fitness in Post had nothing to do with your kidney stones.
That is absolutely true, because I had to grow them before I joined you. So
yes. But funny, now that you've joined Fitness in Post, you're getting rid of them. So there we go.
That's right. And for those of you who want to know, by the way, quick story: if you don't want to have kidney stones, drink a lot of water. That's All right. Thank you very much, Zach. We're going to play our exit song, and we will be done.
Now I'm going home.
I am grateful. Grateful to get away.
Fine. I'll be quiet. I'll be quiet if you will.
All right. I'll be quiet.
Fine.
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 It's a perfect ending.
Goodbye, dear.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
But when will I see you again?
Oh, never. Never.
Never.
That's the worst goodbye I've ever heard. And you stole it from a movie.
Okay, Barry, time to go home now.
Well, thank you very much, Pamela. You've given us a lot to go away and think about.
I had a fun time. Now turn that off.
I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing.
And that's the end of that.